So in this video, I'm going to try to illustrate to you Fortinet and its SD-WAN capabilities that I tested, and there are no straightforward documentation that will tell you all of this. You just have to Google it and find out and play it. So this is what I found. With Fortinet, what I have done in this setup is I have tested the overlay. So overlay with IPSEC to remote sites. So in my case, this firewall here, firewall 1, is, let's just say, one of the sites or data center. And then this is the remote site. And then I've got two remote sites I'm routing on the 10 network, obviously. And then for the underlay, which is using the physical ports, it's obviously going to the internet. And the routing is with default route, quad 0. Now here's the diagram. So I've got this Linux machine that you can see on the side, and it's running pings. And it's running pings to 123.1.1.1, which is the internet. And this is my internet right here. Two VIOS routers. Both of them have loopbacks with the 123. So I'm running pings to the internet, and I am running pings to the remote sites or site. Two 2.1.1/24. That's my remote sites. This address is here, configured to another puppy Linux, and the address here is 10.2.2.111. The address of this firewall is obviously the default gateway 10.2.2.10, just like this one, 10.1.1.10. So the setup is Linux machine here reaching out to Linux machine here on the remote site. And this Linux machine or user is also reaching out to the internet. Okay. So it's a split tunnel right here. Traffic is routed between tunnels, IPSEC tunnels, two IPSEC tunnels, point to point. Tunnel 1 and tunnel 2. Both are pinned. So you have essentially what you have is a data center connected to the user or the LAN. And then this edge device or firewall, Fortinet in this case, is connected to two transports. Transport 1 is on port 2, connected to VIOS 1, Ethernet 0, and then Ethernet 1 on VIOS is connected to port 2. This is not correct. Port 2 and port 3. This is port 4. Port 4 is connected to the LAN. Port 4 is connected to the LAN here too. So port 2 mapped to port 2. Tunnel 1 basically is mapped to port 2 on both sides. Tunnel 2 is mapped to port 3 on both sides. Again, you can put whatever IP addressing in on the VIOS. The only routing that I have configured is really the point-to-point. Now for VIOS 1 and VIOS 2, to know what these networks, you just put static routes, and VIOS 1 and VIOS 2 should be able to reach from here to here and from here to here. Both of these static routes needs to be configured on your VIOSes to reach each other. Once that is done, your internet routing is configured, right? Now you have tunnels that are configured, IPSEC tunnels, point to point. And you have the internet, which is living on the loopbacks, right? Now, the way SD-WAN works for Fortinet is that you got to configure SLA, service level agreement. In my case, is lowest cost. So what that means is whichever path has lowest latency, it'll switch to that automatically, right? So right now on this port, I have 20 milliseconds. And on this port 3, I have 30 milliseconds. And my SLA says that if something goes above 50 milliseconds, switch to the lowest path. So right now, 20 and 30, out of the 20 and 30, 20 is lowest. SLA says 50 is your threshold. And I'll show you those configs. But the key thing is your SLA configuration needs to be working for the underlay, which is your ports, physical ports, and your overlay. Then you need 2 SLAs to be functional for overlay and underlay. That's the key thing. So point number 1, SLA needs to be for overlay and also for underlay. That's 2 SLAs, and then your routing. Your routing and all of this, I'm configuring firewall 1 for all of this, and then I'll show you how it switches. Your routing needs to point to quad 0 for port 2 and port 3, and that's your underlay. And then the second one is your routing needs to point to 10 network for the overlay to tunnel 1 and tunnel 2. Now when you configure your SLA and SD-WAN rules, you're going to use these ports for the SD-WAN zones. So you have 2 zones, underlay and overlay. So this is your basic configuration. Now your underlay SLA will work right away because you're pointing, your firewall has got a quad 0 to the pointer to port 1 and 2, right? Now for your overlay, you got to do a CLI configuration to make it work. Otherwise, it's not going to come up. And if it's not going to come up, then it's not going to converge or work. So having said that, again, my pings are reaching the internet on 20 milliseconds and 30 milliseconds. You can see that right here on this guy. That it's pinging two IPs. Let's see if I can. We'll maximize. But here are the two IPs. 10.2.2.111, 123.111. Both are actually experiencing approximately 20 plus milliseconds of latency. So you let's keep an eye on that. There are two pings going, 123 and 10. And then I'm going to, it's pretty quick, increase the latency. On my port 2. So I'm now increasing my latency right here, port 2, from 20 to 200. So let's keep an eye on this guy. It's going to be very quick. $200, and it quickly, look at that. Let's try to stop that. 200, and it immediately converts to 30 millisecond. Okay, this is the one with 30 milliseconds. Here's 30 milliseconds on the firewall interface. Port 2, I just changed that to 200, and port 3 is 30. See how quickly it converts from 200 to 30. Now going back to 220, it takes time because obviously that's a mechanism built into it to fail back. So it's both of them, underlay and overlay, are taking 30 milliseconds. Now, my primary link, and again, I'm working on the lowest cost here, so it was going to choose the lowest one. So I go back to my port 2, and I say, okay, now it's back to normal, to 20 milliseconds. And it's going to take a little bit of time so that it doesn't fluctuate quickly. So it's back to 220 from 30. It moved back 200, and then the latency came back to 20. Now this is, it's going to come back to 20. It takes a little time. So what is the configuration of this firewall? Let's move this guy here so that you have an underlay as well as the overlay convergence at the same time. It's back to primary 20. So let's take a look at that. Here's my primary firewall. So obviously you'll have firewall policies and all that, but let's take a look first at the static routes. So my static routes are looking like this. Got a quad 0 to port 2, quad 0 to port 3. I've got a 10/8 to tunnel 1 and 10/8 to tunnel 2. All of them have same distance, same priority, equal cost path. But my SD-WAN, if there was no SD-WAN, this is going to be load balanced. But my SD-WAN tells me that here's my SD-WAN rule that's telling me to go low cost. And you can change that to whatever. Typically, that's what your SD-WAN is supposed to do. It's supposed to converge to the lowest cost path dynamically, which a traditional routing protocol will not do. So here's my SD-WAN to the second firewall, and here's to the internet. Two SD-WAN rules. And this is what I'm using, lowest cost SLA. And for the overlay, I'm choosing the tunnels, and I have an SLA target of overlay check, and I'll show you that. And the second SLA is for the underlay, so that I'll have the physical ports in there. Physical ports, underlay checks. So two, again, lowest cost. Two different checks. And those are my underlay and overlay. And let's take a look at the performance SLA. I need to bookmark this too. Here's my checks. I'm detecting a server 10.2.2.111, which is on the overlay, the other side of the network. Overlay check going over the tunnel. This will not come up unless you do a CLI configuration. So it's not a GUI enabled feature that you can go and check. For the overlay check, you have your server as 10.2.2.111, which is this server right here from the data center or from the remote site. And your SD-WAN members, you're going to specify tunnels. You're going to enable the target to 50 or whatever you want, and that's about it. And you have to make sure your static route is updated. Exactly the same thing for the underlay. You're choosing servers 30010 and 50010. This is what my servers are. Or these are the IPs that I'm checking. This is 30010 and this is 50010. This is network 3, network 5, network 1, and network 2. So I'm from here, my SLA is pinging these ports to see which one has better latency. Exactly the same thing, just using the underlay ports here. And all of this should turn green, otherwise it's not going to work. Now for the overlay, when you complete your configuration, let me just show you, this is not going to come up, like I said already, unless you do a CLI thing. So you got the static routes, you got the performance SLA, and your rules are there. Now your zones are pretty straightforward. You got two zones, one for the remote site and one for the internet. And you just put in the tunnels, interfaces in it. That's straightforward. and you got the rules going. And then obviously your firewall policy would say that you are allowing from port 4 to the tunnel and port 4 to the internet and what have you. I can show you that too quickly, what I have here. It's a firewall, not a router, so you got to write policies for everything. You got firewall, which is the tunnel interface coming to port 4, which is my LAN port, and then LAN port to the tunnel. Same thing, LAN port to the internet, and that is reversed. So this one is basically, you just need this guy. This is, I was testing it, you don't need the reverse one unless you have a firewall that you want to implement it to. For a complete setup on both sides, you're going to need 2 policies. But right now, for traffic initiating from the LAN port to the tunnel, that's all you need, right? So that's your policies. You got the SD-WAN rules, you got the zones, you got the static routes, you got the SLA. Now, how do I make this guy when you configure all of this stuff, your overlay check will not come up. For that, you will have to go to the CLI and configure SD-WAN manually. And here, you're going to have to configure the source to be your LAN port. Otherwise, your SLA is not going to come up. So 10.1.1.10 in this case is this guy right here. So unless you configure your SLA to take the source, it's not going to go over this tunnel and check the server on the other side. By default, it's going to try to take the tunnel port or some other address, but you got to specify the source for this SLA to work. Once you do that, it comes up. You got to go to the system SD-WAN members and configure the source address on both the SLA for tunnel 1 and tunnel 2, and that's it. Once you do that, once your routing and rules and policies are configured correctly, as I showed, this would work. And this setup would work for your overlay traffic as well as underlay traffic to the internet. Hope this helps.